Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse, and before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains about precision transportation. And today, we are going to discuss the Norfolk and Western Railway, which, well, I was about to say it's a fallen flag railway, but that's not actually true. In a way, they're one of a handful of railways in America that actually survived the hard times that occurred during the mid to late 20th century. This is the story of the rise and survival of the Norfolk and Western Railway. The Norfolk and Western Railway, or NNW, like many railways, didn't actually start out with that name at all. The origins of NNW began in eastern Virginia, when the General Assembly chartered the City Point Railroad during early 1836. From there, as other smaller railroads blossomed up, well, mergers started taking place. By the time the 1900s rolled around, well, NNW was something way different than how it had started. In fact, by the end of their existence as Norfolk and Western, they would be the combination of more than 200 railroad mergers, taking place from their beginning all the way up until 1982. NNW was a dominant force for most of their existence after 1900. Part of that has to do with their location. See, in 1900, the coal business boomed out of control, which is funny, because part of the reason was, well, the locomotives themselves. Steam power was all the rage. That's how the railroads operated. And it was also mostly how people produced electricity. So coal needed to be mined and shipped. NNW's lines were in both Virginia, but more in particularly West Virginia. West Virginia is maximum tier coal country. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, the coal lines were one of the most lucrative things that NNW had. In fact, one of their nicknames was King Coal. They just moved so much coal, all the while competing with nearby railroads such as the Virginian and Chesapeake and Ohio. Additionally, there were only a handful of times past 1900 where they actually added lines on their own. Generally, they merged with other lines, consuming everything around them. They acquired the Lynchburg and Durham Railroad, they acquired Cincinnati, Portsmouth, and Virginia, and those are only just a couple of examples. They also had a lot of really lucrative interchange points with Western Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Baltimore and Ohio. At the railroad's peak, it consisted of over 2,100 route miles, which is actually pretty small for a Class 1, even in those days. But that kind of worked to their advantage. They didn't have a lot of lines to maintain necessarily. They weren't a sprawling behemoth, but a centralized precision railway. Every line they had was efficient, and that was one of their best saving graces during hard times. Coal wasn't the only thing they moved around. They did have passenger service for one, and they also invested in rolling stock to move agriculture and merchandise. But coal was their big thing. That was the real moneymaker. Those coal drags were way too profitable for them to ever not invest in it. In fact, even as late as the 1980s, coal still comprised 60% of their annual tonnage. And over the years, it made them money. Just so much money. Even during times like the Great Depression, where plenty of other railroads that I've talked about on this channel have gone into bankruptcy because of the economic hardship, NNW never did. No, seriously. They were still loaded even during one of the worst economic crises in world history. And it seems to be down to two factors that I've already mentioned. The fact that they really weren't that big in the grand scheme of things meant that their annual maintenance and upkeep costs were rather low, and the coal. Regardless of how well the economy was doing, the country needed coal, and the coal needed to be moved. Period. End of story. NNW was on top of that. So because their major moneymaker was something that really couldn't be stopped. Even if other industries were suffering, well, N&W was fine. They were so wealthy that, like many railroads, they attempted to electrify as early as 1913. Their electrification program was meant to deal with the really steep grades on Elkhorn Mountain, west of Bluefield, West Virginia. Again, this is the Appalachian Mountains, and, well, they're mountains. The locomotives they had to use to pull heavy coal trains on steep grades consisted of engines like 2662 Z-1s, which were compound Malays. But electric locomotives had a lot better potential because they didn't actually produce their own power. They just, ran off the lines. It was a thing that had been proven to work, and if they could utilize it well, it might actually save them money in the long run. Plus, they had a lot of money anyway, so why not? They worked with Westinghouse directly to implement the electric lines, initially opening 36.18 miles from Bluefield to Farm, which was near Vivian in 1914. That system carried 11,000 volts at 25 hertz, with substations located at Bluefield, Vivian, Mayberry, and North Fork. They got a hold of some electric locomotives, and it turned out pretty well, all things considered. They actually extended it through World War I, when coal demands went through the roof, and eventually the main line was energized across nearly 53 miles. However, unlike some rail lines who had their electric routes all the way through the 20th century, N&W didn't keep them around for whatever reason. They really liked steam locomotives, which will become relevant later. One of the things they eventually wound up doing, right after World War II, was carry out a $12 million capital improvement program to eliminate the grades entirely by constructing a 5-mile double-tracked bypass. As a result of that, those electrified lines weren't needed anymore, and they were retired in 1950. But steam still stuck around, supported by well-engineered, heavy stretches of rail. The lines were double-tracked, terminals were modernized all the time, and classification yards were expanded. And they continued to push new steam designs, even into the late 1950s, when some other lines were starting to dieselize. The Roanoke shops were actually notorious for possibly having better engineers, at least when it came to manufacturing steam engines, than even the legendary Alco and Baldwin. Those shops turned out amazing steam locomotive designs, like the 2664As, the 2882Ys, and the legendary 484Js. Their steam tech peaked in the mid-50s, with no other system in America operating designs nearly as advanced as N&W had. Why were they sticking with steam so much? Well, it seems to have a lot to do with their president, Robert H. Smith. Smith loved steam engines, and hey, who can blame him? I do too! But he didn't just love them, he also truly believed the tech wasn't as obsolete as everyone seemed to think it was. With companies like EMD aggressively marketing their new diesels, saying that they were the future, and other rail lines immediately picking them up and transitioning over to improve efficiency, Smith felt that it was possible to improve steam to a level where not only would it be equal with diesel, but possibly even superior. Basically, Smith was kind of a real-life American version of Sir Topham Hatt from the Thomas the Tank Engine series. Many fans of the series love Sir Topham Hatt because he protected his steam locomotives on his own rail line. Smith, when he was in control of N&W, did much the same thing. In fact, they only started purchasing diesels in 1955, and that was very reluctantly. They were super stubborn about this, but they weren't completely stupid and did see lines next to them getting some use out of the modern diesels, so they ordered some EMD GP9s. They still didn't get rid of their steam locomotives, though. They weren't just about to scrap everything they had worked to build. But then other issues started cropping up for N&W they just couldn't address without getting more diesels. Rising labor costs, as well as the fact that with the steam industry dying, locating components and spare parts was becoming more difficult and more expensive. They started to not have much of an option but to utilize diesels. Then they received a new president, Stuart Saunders, in 1958. He was very much against steam locomotives at that point. He saw no reason to continue using them and quickly dieselized the whole lines. Wait, Saunders, is that the same? No! Saunders, you were the president of Norfolk and Western before you came to help me with Penn Central? I'm sorry, I didn't say anything, Mr. Probert. I just didn't think it mattered. You let them keep their steam locomotives? No, Mr. Probert, I didn't. I scrapped them. I dieselized the whole lines. Saunders, I'm very pleased with you. Oh. Well, I'm so glad to hear that, sir. Yes, it is excellent to hear that you decided to destroy those steam engines. All of them, correct? Well, I mean, a few got into preservation. 611's still around. You let them be preserved? Well, yeah, we had plenty of money. We could afford to donate a few. Oh, thanks, steam and Mr. Browman, stop! It was mostly down to Saunders' speed that many steam locomotives from Norfolk and Western were lost. He did the dieselization within only a couple years, when it probably could have been stretched out and many could have been donated. NNW was one of the few lines in America that could afford to do that. However, due to the efficiency gained from utilizing diesel power, NNW was put in a really unique position. Compared to every other rail line in the area, they were basically the only one that was, well, in good shape. Some were in fine condition, some were slightly under the weather but could improve, but NNW was good. Really good. They had plenty of money, they still had plenty of traffic, and the coal industry was on the decline in the 60s, but it wasn't out. Even without steam locomotives to consume them, power plants still used plenty of coal, so NNW was perfectly fine. They were in such a good position that corporate shenanigans began to be their method of operation. They had a shell company called Derico Inc., and they utilized that to acquire Erie, Lackawanna, and Delaware and Hudson at a distance. They were in control of the lines, but it wasn't a complete merger, so it could protect their core assets just in case something bad happened with them. On top of the blessings they had due to their location and main source of traffic, they had a pretty good history of being very well managed. The leaders in charge of NNW are historically very, 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 very smart, and know exactly what needs to happen for the rail line to move forward. Despite the uphill battle that many lines face, NNW was good at maneuvering around hurdles that were thrown in their path. They attempted to manage Erie, Lackawanna into a better position, but their quite literal position was making that difficult. They were sandwiched near both the Pennsylvania Railroad and New York Central, which merged to create Penn Central. And then that blew up. Basically, literally. It really might as well have. Erie, Lackawanna could not be salvaged, especially when Hurricane Agnes slammed into the lines, so NNW sold off the interests. That's alright. It was getting to be the late 70s, and NNW was still in a very strong position. They still had solid coal traffic, they still had plenty of lines working and open, their rolling stock was in good condition, their tracks and infrastructure were in good condition, they were fine. What could possibly go, "Hello, friends?" And then came CSX. CSX was a merger of a bunch of other lines, the Chessie System, the Seaboard Coastline, as well as a few other smaller carriers. But the end result created a monster of a rail network. And unlike Penn Central that was destroyed due to a hefty amount of mismanagement and government oversight, CSX had the blessing of being conceived at a time of less government oversight and having better management. Their scope dwarfed NNW by a considerable margin. Suddenly they felt like a small fish next to this monster. How were they ever going to compete when CSX owned so much territory? They needed a partner in this, someone to help them out. A friend. An ally! Hey. Oh, hey guys. Southern Railway had always been nearby, basically bordering Norfolk and Western. The two had been rivals over the years, but with CSX challenging both of them and putting their own respective businesses at risk, it was time to get along. In 1980, despite both actually being in very good condition, they started talking about merging. It's weird for me to say it like that, because if you've been watching videos on my channel so far, pretty much any time a railroad starts talking about merging, it's because they're doing really badly. But in this case, both Norfolk and Western and the Southern were actually in very good shape. They just had the foresight to know they probably couldn't take on CSX alone. But together, they would have almost as much territory, and they had a history of being managed in very similar ways, and being, frankly, successful. Interestingly, possibly due to the threat of CSX, the ICC actually approved the merger within just about 2 years, which is way faster than I think they've approved anything ever before, or since, until they stopped being a thing. The new company that was born out of this was called Norfolk Southern Corporation. If you live on the East Coast, you may be familiar with them. They are one of the major Class 1 railways in the United States. In fact, I live very close to one of their major hubs, and I see their diesels all the time. Born out of 2 successful rail lines, they've continued their trend of being, frankly, just pretty good at their job. They are still at the top of the industry in terms of annual revenue, and it's likely they'll be sticking around for quite a long time. And as I mentioned, there are plenty of their old steam locomotives, such as the very famous J-Class, number 611, still around. She herself is known as the Queen of Steam, as well as the Spirit of Roanoke, and she does a good job of representing not only herself and her phenomenal class, but also one of the most successful railways in American history. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders: Thomas Ward, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Benjamin Owens, Painter Kitchen 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Matthew Gavin, Arthur Roy, DM Tropical Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Alaric Jaspers, Brian, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Major Klutz, Hayden DeGrow, Ohio Trucker 1, and Ty Hammonds Jr. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.